It is April 2nd, 1986. At exactly 1 p.m. local time, TWA Flight 840 levels off smoothly at cruising altitude over the Mediterranean Sea. Sunlight pours through the thin plexiglass windows, turning the water below into a glittering sheet of fractured silver. To the 121 passengers and crew on board the Boeing 727-231, it feels like just another ordinary afternoon in the sky. Inside the cockpit, the routine is almost comforting. Captain Richard Collingwood, a veteran with thousands of hours on the 727, glances at the clock, then back to the flight instruments. Everything matches the plan: altitude steady, airspeed stable, fuel balanced. To his right, First Officer Gary Ziegler monitors the radios, his tone calm and clipped as he acknowledges instructions from air traffic control. Behind them, Flight Engineer Jim Bennett runs yet another scan of his systems panel: hydraulics, electrics, pressurization, all in the green. There is nothing in the data to suggest that danger is already inside the aircraft. In the cabin, the atmosphere is relaxed. A family returning from vacation shares snacks brought from Rome. A businessman folds his newspaper and closes his eyes, grateful for the smooth ride. A group of students leans over a route map, tracing the line from Italy to Greece with a finger, joking about who will be the first to jump into the Aegean once they land. Flight attendants move steadily up and down the aisle, checking seatbelts, answering questions, beginning to mentally prepare for the upcoming descent into Athens. The Boeing 727, tail number N54340, hums confidently through the thin air at 37,000 feet. Outside, the sky is clear, the horizon sharp, the world below deceptively peaceful. At 1:04 p.m., a faint vibration passes through the forward floor section of the aircraft. It is subtle, so small that most passengers do not notice it at all. But in the cockpit, the captain feels it like a brief shiver through the controls. He frowns, glances at the engine gauges, then toward the flight engineer. "Did you feel that?" he asks. Bennett lifts his eyes from the panel. "Yeah, maybe a bit of turbulence," he replies, though the air is perfectly smooth. His eyes sweep the pressurization indicators, the structural warning systems. Nothing is out of limits. No lights, no horns, no obvious faults. The vibration fades. The captain files it in the back of his mind. A mental sticky note, nothing more. At 1:06 p.m., Athens Control clears TWA 840 to continue along its planned route toward Greek airspace. The first officer reads back the clearance, his voice level, almost bored. The crew begins the descent briefing. They review approach charts, expected winds, runway assignment. The script is familiar, rehearsed over hundreds of flights. This one feels no different. It is, in fact, critically different, because somewhere under the cabin floor, near the midsection of the aircraft, a hidden device, placed there by human hands during an earlier leg, has been quietly biding its time. Not days, not weeks, years. An explosive charge smuggled into the structure beneath a passenger seat, dormant and forgotten, carried unknowingly on flight after flight across continents. Today, finally, it will detonate. At 1:07 p.m., time inside TWA Flight 840 splits in two. A violent explosion erupts beneath the right side of the cabin around row 15. The blast tears open the fuselage like paper, blowing a jagged hole in the side of the aircraft. Floor panels buckle downward. Seat frames twist and snap. Insulation, fragments of plastic, metal, fabric, and human bodies are hurled outward into the thin air at nearly 8 miles above the sea. The cabin pressure, stable a second earlier, vanishes in an instant. The scream of escaping air is deafening. Oxygen masks drop from the ceiling as the cabin altitude spikes. Passengers are thrown from their seats, some pinned, others pulled toward the new mouth in the side of the aircraft. A mother clutches at her child. Another passenger disappears completely, ripped from the cabin and into the sky before anyone can react. In the cockpit, the explosion feels like a brutal kick to the belly of the airplane. The 727 shudders violently. Warning horns blare. Red lights flash across the engineer's panel. The autopilot struggles to maintain control as the aerodynamic balance of the aircraft changes in a single heartbeat. The captain's training takes over. His hand grabs the control yoke. "Masks on," he shouts. His voice is loud, but partially drowned by the roar of air rushing through the ruptured hull. He reaches for his own oxygen mask and pulls it into place, the elastic straps snapping against his headset. The first officer's headset fills with white noise and static. He fights with his microphone, trying to transmit a mayday, but his first words are swallowed by the chaos. The flight engineer's world becomes a kaleidoscope of alarms. Cabin alt, differential pressure, environmental system faults. Nearly every warning associated with pressurization seems to light up at once. The 727 begins to descend. Not yet an organized emergency descent, but an uncontrolled response to the sudden loss of pressure and disruption of airflow. Within seconds, the crew faces a second enemy, one more insidious than the explosion itself. They no longer agree on what, exactly, has happened. The captain recognizes the signs of rapid decompression and anchors his mind to that diagnosis. To him, the priority is clear: get the aircraft down to a breathable altitude as fast as possible. He wants a steep descent, oxygen masks on, and a direct path to the nearest runway. The first officer feels something different through the controls, an abnormal vibration, a change in how the wings respond to input. To him, this does not feel like just decompression. It feels like structural damage, perhaps near the wing root or leading edge. In his mind, a too aggressive descent might push the airframe beyond its limits and tear the aircraft apart. The flight engineer, overwhelmed by the flood of warnings, anchors instead to the possibility of an equipment bay or electrical explosion. To him, the immediate risk is fire or short circuit, so he begins isolating electrical buses that feed the mid-cabin area where the explosion likely occurred. Free professionals, free interpretations, one crippled aircraft. That tiny fracture in shared understanding, which lasts only seconds, becomes the seed of a much larger problem: the slow collapse of cockpit resource management. The captain calls for an emergency descent checklist. The first officer hesitates for a breath, just long enough to recheck airspeed, just long enough to question whether the aircraft can safely handle the required pitch and power changes. The engineer, acting on his own initiative, reaches for switches that will depower parts of the cabin. His intent is good. His timing is disastrous. When he cuts power to one of the electrical buses, sections of the cabin lighting and portions of the public address system go dark. Flight attendants, already fighting shock and panic in the cabin, suddenly find themselves trying to calm terrified passengers in partial darkness, shouting over the roar of the wind with no working PA. In the cockpit, the interphone crackles to life. A flight attendant's voice breaks through in jagged fragments. Explosion, hole in the side, people missing, injuries everywhere. The words hang in the cockpit like a second shockwave. This is not a blown window, not a ruptured duct, not a simple equipment fire. This is a bomb. But realization does not automatically produce unity. Instead of locking into a tight, coordinated response, each man doubles down on his own mental picture of the crisis. The captain's voice hardens. "Get us down," he repeats, more forcefully now. The first officer's tone climbs slightly as he warns about airspeed and load factors. The engineer continues reporting system statuses that neither pilot can fully process. The aircraft, though damaged, is still flyable. The controls respond. The engines deliver thrust. The basic structure of the 727 is holding, for now. But the real danger is no longer mechanical. It has moved into the human domain. The cockpit still physically controls the airplane, yet control of the situation itself is beginning to slip away through the invisible cracks created by distraction, competing priorities, and incomplete communication. The explosion has broken metal and flesh. The next minutes will test something even more fragile: the crew's ability to act as one mind under unbearable pressure. None of them senses how close disaster is. The next minutes inside the cockpit of TWA Flight 840 become a test of focus and discipline under conditions no simulator has ever fully recreated. The aircraft is wounded, the cabin torn open, the passengers traumatized. And in the sealed space of the flight deck, a new enemy presses in, narrowing attention. The captain forces his gaze back to the instruments. Altitude is bleeding off, but not fast enough to satisfy his instinct. In his mind, every second spent above 10,000 feet is an unnecessary gamble with hypoxia and structural stress. He calls again for an emergency descent, this time with a sharper edge in his voice. The first officer hears the order, but his mind is split between obedience and doubt. Control feedback still feels strange. There is a subtle shudder in the airframe, a reminder that a section of the fuselage is now missing. If they pitch down too aggressively, if their speed creeps too high, the forces on the damaged structure could multiply. He wants a controlled descent, not a dive. To him, the greater risk is tearing the aircraft apart before they ever reach breathable air. What neither man fully recognizes in that instant is that they are no longer just flying an airplane. They are negotiating two different mental pictures of reality, and neither has the full truth. The engineer is locked in a world of numbers and gauges. He calls out that cabin altitude is still climbing but will stabilize as they descend. He reports hydraulic and fuel systems intact. He confirms that engine performance remains normal. In his headset, the roar of air and the hiss of his own breathing under the mask blend into a white noise fog. The captain snaps back. "I need descent now." The first officer finally commits, pulling power back and pitching the nose over more decisively. The altimeter unwinds more rapidly. Vertical speed increases. The aircraft's nose dips toward the invisible horizon. Passengers in the back feel their stomachs shift as gravity tilts against them. In the cabin, chaos has a structure of its own. Flight attendants, trained for decompression but not for a section of the fuselage missing, anchor themselves against seatbacks as they push forward. They count rows, check for consciousness, try to identify who is still belted in and who is not. The wind tearing through the breach rips at clothing, paper, and fragments of luggage. An entire row of seats near the blast area is twisted and charred. Where one passenger had been moments earlier, there is now only open sky and a ragged hull. Those seated nearby are in shock, faces bleeding from shrapnel, eyes inflamed from the sudden blast of freezing air. One attendant kneels beside a severely injured passenger, pressing a towel against a wound while trying not to be pulled toward the opening with every change in pitch. She shouts, but the words vanish into the wind. They manage to establish sporadic communication with the cockpit. "We have a hole in the fuselage, multiple injuries, one passenger gone. We need to get down quickly," a flight attendant yells into the interphone. The message arrives and bursts in fragments, but it is enough. Now the gravity of the situation is clear. This is no hypothetical decompression scenario from a training manual. This is catastrophic structural damage and confirmed fatalities. The captain's jaw tightens. The decision is no longer up for debate. He declares a mayday and demands priority routing to Athens. The first officer, still anxious about the structural loads, nonetheless follows his lead. This is where discipline asserts itself. Personal theories yield to the chain of command. He reads the emergency descent checklist out loud while handling radio communications. "Speed brakes deployed," he announces. The panels extend, biting into the airflow. The aircraft shudders in response, but remains controllable. The engineer confirms that pressurization is no longer being maintained. They are essentially flying unpressurized now, racing the descent profile to reach a survivable cabin altitude. The 727 drops through 20,000 feet, then 18,000. Outside, the Mediterranean sun is unchanged. Every small vibration invites dread. Is this just turbulence or the prelude to catastrophic breakup? The captain forces himself to widen his situational awareness. "Confirm Athens as nearest suitable," he demands. The first officer quickly checks their position against the charts. Diverting elsewhere would cost time they no longer have. Athens remains the logical choice. He confirms it. ATC responds. Runway priority, vectors direct. This is where the earlier drift in cockpit coordination begins to reverse. The crew starts speaking in shorter, cleaner sentences. The captain flies. The first officer handles radios and checklists. The engineer owns the systems. Their roles snap back into alignment. Not perfectly, but noticeably. Under the pressure, they are rediscovering the framework that cockpit resource management is supposed to provide. Still, distraction lurks at the edges of their focus. The engineer keeps glancing at pressurization values that are now meaningless. The aircraft is vented to the outside world. No system can restore a missing piece of fuselage, but his training pulls his attention back to those gauges. Each glance is a small theft of mental energy that could be spent on more relevant threats. The first officer, still uncomfortable with the vibration, occasionally eases the descent rate despite the captain's desire for speed. Each adjustment is defensible. None alone is catastrophic. But collectively, they stretch the time the aircraft spins at marginal altitudes where another failure, structural, mechanical, or human, could still prove fatal. In the cabin, passengers begin to sense that the aircraft is descending and that oxygen masks have done their work. For some, the shock recedes into numbness. For those near the breach, the horror is ongoing. They must stare at the open sky, at the ripped metal edges, at the space where a fellow traveler once sat. The flight attendants improvise restraints using belts, scarves, straps from carry-on bags, anything to secure those closest to the edge. The temperature has dropped drastically. They are, in their own way, engaged in the same fight as the cockpit, buying time and stabilizing chaos. Back in the cockpit, the altimeter sweeps past 15,000 feet. The engineer calls out cabin altitude. For the first time since the explosion, his numbers sound less like a death sentence. The differential is dropping. Soon, even if their masks failed, they would remain conscious. The captain feels the tension in his shoulders ease, just a fraction. He orders the descent to level at around 10,000 feet. Below that altitude, breathable air is guaranteed. Above it, they are still vulnerable. The first officer acknowledges and begins planning the transition from emergency descent back to controlled flight and approach. The radios crackle. Athens approach wants confirmation. Nature of emergency, souls on board, fuel remaining. The first officer compresses a nightmare into a few clipped phrases. Explosion on board, structural damage, decompression, injuries and possible fatalities, requesting immediate landing. On the other end, controllers begin clearing airspace, moving other aircraft aside to open a corridor for the wounded trijet. At 10,000 feet, the captain eases the nose up and brings the descent under tighter control. The vertical speed decreases. The sensation in the cabin shifts from freefall to a more normal, if still steep, approach profile. The engineer reports that the engines remain healthy, fuel is sufficient, hydraulics unchanged. On paper, they have everything they need to land the aircraft. In reality, they are flying an unknown quantity, a machine that has already failed once in a way no system predicted. The captain knows this. He does not trust the airframe blindly. He keeps his movement smooth, his speed conservative. He will not let hidden damage, invisible on the instruments, ambush them close to the ground. Still, one question hangs between the three men. What else has that explosion compromised? Control cables? Electrical routing? Structural members near the landing gear attachments? There is no way to know, not at 10,000 feet and 250 knots, with the sea below and a bleeding cabin behind them. They will have to find out the only way pilots ever can in such circumstances. They will have to keep flying the airplane, one decision at a time, and hope that the machine holds together long enough to reach the runway that now waits, unseen but promised, somewhere ahead in the haze. The runway ahead is still hidden by distance and haze, but Athens controllers have carved out a sterile corridor for the wounded trijet. Every aircraft in the vicinity has been rerouted. Radar screens across the control room show a single red target descending steadily, TWA Flight 840, dragging an invisible trail of urgency and human loss behind it. Inside the cockpit, the tension tightens again. The emergency descent bought them breathable air, but it did not solve the deeper uncertainty. They are now flying a machine with an unpredictable structural wound. The captain knows that the real test begins below 10,000 feet, when aerodynamic loads shift during configuration changes, slats, flaps, landing gear. Each change is a question posed to an airframe that may or may not still be capable of answering. The first officer pulls up the approach chart again. His hands tremble slightly, not from fear, but from adrenaline lingering after the descent. He forces them still against the clipboard. Runway 33 left is available, he reports. Wind 230 at 15 knots. Slight crosswind. Visibility 10 kilometers. The captain nods, but says nothing. His attention is locked on how the aircraft feels, its subtle vibrations, its responsiveness, its balance. Pilots are taught to trust instruments, but in moments like this, Instinct becomes an equal partner. The airplane is speaking through the controls, through the way the nose responds to pressure, through the small tremors that run up the column. The captain listens with all the focus he has left. Behind them, the engineer continues scanning his panel. He focuses on hydraulics, because if the blast damaged any of the hydraulic lines running beneath the floor, they could lose control authority at low altitude. So far, everything reads stable. He calls out the pressures again for reassurance, perhaps for himself as much as for the pilots. The captain breaks the silence. "We're not configuring early," he says firmly. "No flaps until we're aligned. No gear until 3 miles. It is an unorthodox approach, but a rational one. The less they ask of the airframe, the lower the risk of triggering a secondary failure." The first officer hesitates. Landing a 727 fast and clean is possible but demanding. The aircraft is designed to be configured gradually, its weight balanced by extended flaps that allow slower, stabilized approaches. Landing too fast raises the risk of runway overrun. Landing too clean raises the risk of touchdown instability. But landing traditionally could expose damaged structural components. The captain sees the hesitation. "We fly it like it is," he says, "not like we wish it was." The phrase settles over the cockpit like a commandment. Athens' approach instructs them to descend to 3,000 feet and expect vectors for a straight-in approach. The first officer reads back the clearance, his voice steadier now. The engineer tightens his lap belt and presses his knees against the console, bracing, not for impact necessarily, but for the unknown. In the cabin, survival is its own choreography. Flight attendants move row by row, assessing injuries and attempting triage despite limited resources. Some passengers are bleeding, some in shock, some praying. The cold air from the fuselage breach still whips through the cabin, carrying with it the salt of the Mediterranean and the metallic scent of torn aluminum. Blankets are distributed. Seats near the opening are reinforced with belts and improvised restraints. The attendants' eyes are red, their hands trembling, but they remain composed enough to continue working. One passenger, his face cut by debris, clutches the armrest with white knuckles. "Are we going to make it?" he asks repeatedly to anyone who passes. A flight attendant pauses, meets his eyes, and offers a firm, steady nod. She cannot speak. The wind is too loud, but her expression carries the message. In the cockpit, the captain begins reducing speed carefully. The 727 remains responsive but feels looser, in yaw, a sign that airflow over the tail might be disrupted by the breach. He compensates gently with rudder trims. Every adjustment is measured, every movement deliberate. As they descend through 5,000 feet, Athens comes into sight, an expanse of urban sprawl framed by mountains and coastline. The runways of Elinikan Airport stretch out like lifelines in the distance. The first officer checks wind again. The captain's hands tighten around the yoke. They are approaching the phase where small mistakes can have massive consequences. Approach control hands them off to tower. TWA 840, you are cleared to land. Runway 33 left. Emergency crews are standing by. The captain responds, cleared to land. 33 left. He lowers the nose slightly to maintain speed. They will be landing faster and cleaner than usual. The 727's long, pointed profile extends ahead like a spear, slicing through the last layers of haze. At 2,000 feet, the captain makes the call. Flaps 5. It is a small configuration change, just enough to help stabilize pitch, yet it carries enormous risk. The first officer confirms, flaps 5, coming in, and moves the handle. For a fraction of a second, nothing happens. Then the aircraft shudders once, just a twitch, and the flaps deploy. The engineer watches the hydraulic gauges closely. Pressures hold. No alarms sound. The 727 settles slightly, more stable now. They continue. At 1,200 feet, they roll onto final approach. The runway lies ahead, long and welcoming, but the airframe remains an unknown. The captain keeps speed higher than normal, unwilling to flirt with a stall margin compromised by missing structure. Gear down, he orders cautiously. The first officer pulls the lever. The engineer monitors the indicator lights. The nose gear locks. The right main gear locks. The left main gear waits one heartbeat too long. Then it locks. 3 green, the engineer announces, and everyone in the cockpit exhales involuntarily. The final descent feels both slow and impossibly fast. The captain keeps the 727 slightly high, bleeding altitude gently. They pass 500 feet, then 300. The runway markings sharpen. Emergency vehicles cluster along the taxiways, red lights pulsing in anticipation. At 200 feet, the captain begins the flare earlier than normal to compensate for their higher approach speed. The first officer calls out altitudes in crisp, steady increments. 50, 40, 30. The aircraft hovers just above the asphalt, riding the fine line between too hard and too long. The captain eases back on the yoke, coaxing the aircraft to settle. 2010. The main gear touches down with a firm, controlled impact. The damaged fuselage vibrates, but holds. The nose lowers carefully. The captain deploys spoilers manually and applies reverse thrust in measured increments, unwilling to stress the structure more than necessary. The runway rushes beneath them. The airframe shakes, but remains intact. Tires screech. Reverse thrust bites harder. The aircraft decelerates steadily. They are slowing. They are stable. And then, finally, the impossible becomes reality. They stop. For a moment, the cockpit is silent, truly silent, for the first time since the explosion. The oxygen masks hiss softly. No one moves. No one speaks. The aircraft rests on Greek soil, wounded but alive. The captain reaches up and removes his mask, his face pale but controlled. "Let's get everyone off," he says quietly. The danger is not over, not entirely. But they have done the unthinkable. They have brought a bomb-damaged airliner, with a section of its fuselage ripped away, safely to the ground. Behind them, the cabin erupts, not with panic, but with sobbing relief. Trembling hands covering faces, passengers hugging strangers, flight attendants bracing for evacuation duties. Emergency trucks race toward the aircraft, and the story of Flight 840 is far from finished. The landing may be complete, but the forensic battle for truth is only beginning. The emergency vehicles swarm around the aircraft like red and white insects converging on a fallen giant. Firefighters position themselves along the fuselage, their helmets glinting under the Athenian sun. Medical crews rush stair units toward the forward doors while others prepare stretchers and triage stations on the tarmac. Though the engines have spooled down, the aircraft still vibrates with the aftershocks of the ordeal, an exhausted machine that has survived physical and psychological trauma. Inside the cockpit, the crew braces themselves for the next phase. Survival in flight was only the beginning. Now comes the extraction of 121 people from a wounded airframe that could still conceal dangers. Unstable structure, sharp metal edges, compromised wiring, emotional chaos. The captain radios the tower. "We are stopped. Request emergency evacuation. Significant structural damage. Injuries on board." His voice is low, drained of its earlier intensity. The words themselves feel too small for what they have endured. The first officer begins running the evacuation checklist. The engineer shuts down remaining systems, ensuring there are no electrical arcs or fuel-related hazards. The captain monitors the situation outside, watching emergency responders position themselves. They are ready. "Evacuate," the captain commands. Flight attendants spring into motion. Those nearest the forward doors pull levers, and with a metallic thunk, the slides deploy. Wind rushes in through the open exits. The attendants shout commands, guiding passengers toward escape, their voices hoarse from shouting through the decompression earlier. The passengers nearest the blast site need the most help. Some cannot walk. Some are bleeding heavily. Others are frozen in shock, unable to process what has happened. One attendant waves frantically to firefighters who climb a ladder to the ragged opening in the fuselage, the very hole that marked the violent heart of the event. They shine flashlights inside, illuminating bent seat frames and airborne debris lodged in places it doesn't belong. A passenger steps off the slide and collapses to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Another clutches her chest, gasping for breath despite the warm Greek air filling her lungs. A man has to be guided by two rescuers, his face streaked with dry blood. Some passengers emerge barefoot, some with torn clothing, some still holding onto belongings they grabbed out of instinct rather than logic. Once the last passenger clears the aircraft, the captain and first officer leave the cockpit. They descend the stairs slowly, their bodies reminding them of the tension, the oxygen masks, the fight against time and altitude. The engineer follows last, stepping onto the tarmac with wide eyes, as if only now registering the magnitude of the structural wound along the fuselage. Emergency crews surround the crew immediately, checking for injuries. The captain waves them off. "Check the cabin first," he insists. But as the crew stands by, catching their breath amidst the chaos, investigators begin arriving. Greek authorities, airport officials, and soon representatives from the FBI, NTSB, and TWA will gather around the aircraft with a single question burning in their minds. What caused the explosion? The crew cannot yet answer that. They only know that the damage was sudden, violent, and precise. Unlike the uneven tearing of a mechanical failure or the progressive failure of metal fatigue. This was sharp. This was surgical. This was intentional. In the chaos, the cabin crew recounts the missing passenger. Investigators immediately mark the significance. Ejection through the fuselage tear implies an explosive breach, not structural collapse. Someone planted something inside this aircraft. Not during this flight. Security measures in Rome were tighter, but perhaps years earlier, during another route, another time, another political climate. While emergency responders transport the injured to local hospitals, investigators approach the captain. They escort him and the crew to a secure room inside the airport for debriefing. Witnesses begin their statements, still trembling, some in shock. In the makeshift briefing room, the captain removes his uniform jacket, revealing his shirt damp with sweat. He sits heavily in a chair. The first officer rubs his temples. The engineer's hands shake slightly over a cup of water he hasn't yet lifted to his lips. Greek authorities start with basic questions. Describe the moment of the explosion. Did you smell anything unusual? Were there any warnings? The crew gives clear, methodical answers, but investigators notice something beneath the surface. Each man holds his own interpretation of the event. Their mental pictures are shaped by the tasks they were performing during the crisis. The captain describes a sudden decompression and a jolt through the yoke. The first officer describes abnormal vibrations and concerns about structural failure. The engineer describes multiple simultaneous warnings and electrical anomalies. The investigators take notes, recognizing immediately the signs of stress-induced perceptual narrowing, the same human factor they will later analyze in depth. Meanwhile, a forensic team begins examining the aircraft. They approach the fuselage breach carefully. The edges of the tear are crucial. Outward deformation, scorching, and directional blast patterns will reveal what no witness can fully articulate. They kneel beside the opening, running gloved fingers along the metal. The clean outward bend of aluminum leaves no room for doubt. This was a bomb. Inside the cabin, they photograph every inch. Shredded insulation, scorch marks on the floor, seat rails twisted upward, debris embedded in the overhead panel. They note the location under row 15. They note the flight history of the aircraft. They note previous legs where political tensions might have allowed an unknown passenger to plant an explosive device. In a corner of the cabin, they find something else, evidence of electrical damage. Not from the explosion directly, but from the engineer's attempts to isolate affected circuits during flight. It was the correct decision, given the circumstances, but it inadvertently complicated the cabin crew's communication. Investigators will later highlight this moment as a contributing human factor, not a mistake, but an example of how cockpit actions can ripple into unintended consequences. Back in the briefing room, the captain's statement becomes more introspective. He explains the disagreement during descent, the hesitations, the fragmented assumptions. He admits the cockpit momentarily lost full synchronization. It was subtle, but it happened. Investigators listen carefully. CRM, cockpit resource management, is a recurring theme in accident investigations. And even though the crew saved the aircraft, the cracks in coordination matter. They represent vulnerabilities that could be catastrophic in less favorable circumstances. Later in the evening, the NTSB lead investigator begins assembling the emerging picture. This was an onboard explosive device, he tells Greek officials, likely planted long before today. He notes the precision of the blast, the placement under his seat, the timing mechanism that had remained dormant for years. The forensic report from the cabin team aligns perfectly with this theory. Scorch marks indicate a shaped charge or small detonation. powerful enough to rupture the fuselage, but not to destroy the aircraft entirely. The absence of high-speed fragmentation suggests the bomb was designed to produce overpressure, not shrapnel. The device had one purpose: tear a hole in the aircraft at altitude. More questions arise. Why did it detonate now? Was it a delayed device? A malfunction? A timer designed for another flight? And most importantly, who planted it? International intelligence agencies begin connecting dots. The aircraft had once flown a route involving Cairo, Athens, and Beirut. Years earlier, certain groups had been known to target Western carriers. It becomes clear this was not a spontaneous act, but a relic from another era, a long-dormant threat awakened by chance or by flawed timing circuitry. The crew's performance also undergoes forensic review. Investigators examine the cockpit voice recorder. They hear the explosion, the roar of decompression, the strained communication. They analyze the captain's directives, the first officer's concerns, the engineer's system isolation. A pattern emerges. Distraction did not cause the event, it was the bomb. But distraction, momentary fragmentation of attention, shaped the human response. Investigators highlight the divergence of interpretations in the seconds after the blast. They note how the descent profile wavered briefly due to competing risk assessments. They identify how electrical isolation complicated the cabin crew's ability to communicate. But they also acknowledge something else. Despite the fragmentation, despite the stress, despite the unknowns, the crew recovered their coordination in time to execute a safe landing. Their CRM broke, then reformed under unimaginable pressure. It is impossible to ignore the human cost. One life lost, several injured, but the outcome could have been far worse. A bomb detonating at 37,000 feet has ended many flights in disaster. This one did not. Hours later, after the initial rounds of investigation, the captain steps outside into the cool night air. The lights of emergency vehicles still surround the aircraft, now fenced off for forensic work. He stares at the silhouette of the 727. The aircraft he commanded through terror now sits quiet, broken, but dignified in its survival. He exhales slowly. The engineer approaches and stands beside him. "We were lucky," he says softly. The captain shakes his head. "We were prepared and lucky." The distinction matters. Because survival was not the product of a single action, but of every decision, good or imperfect, that kept the aircraft controllable despite the odds. And tomorrow, investigators will continue unraveling not just what the bomb destroyed, but what the crew preserved through sheer discipline and determination. The night deepens over Athens. The runway lights flicker. The wind carries faint echoes of sirens and distant voices. The story of Flight 840 has entered the realm of forensic investigation, but its lessons are only beginning to surface, waiting to reveal the fragile dance between human judgment, technology, and fate. The investigation would unfold not only across the damaged fuselage of TWA Flight 840, but across continents, intelligence networks, outdated flight logs, and memories of geopolitical tensions that had once shaped aviation security. The aircraft remained parked under heavy guard on the apron at Aleinican Airport, its torn fuselage illuminated by floodlights that cast sharp, angular shadows, reminders of the violence that had ripped through metal, air, and human lives. By morning, representatives from the NTSB, FBI, FAA, and Boeing joined Greek investigators to examine the aircraft in full daylight. The wound in the fuselage was unmistakably explosive, aluminum bent outward like petals of a metallic flower, edges blackened with chemical residue. Investigators crouched beside it, photographing every angle with meticulous precision. They traced blast vectors, measured deformation, scraped samples of soot, and collected fragments lodged in torn carpeting. Chemical analysis quickly identified traces of plastic explosive, consistent with devices used in the Middle East during previous years of political conflict. This was not speculation, it was a forensic fingerprint. The engineers from Boeing moved through the cabin with grim faces. They documented how the blast had displaced seat rails, how the pressure differential had warped overhead panels, and how the airplane's structure had somehow absorbed the blast without catastrophic failure. Boeing's lead structural expert said quietly, almost reverently, "She shouldn't have held together this well." And yet, she had. The more investigators learned, the clearer the chain of causality became, and the more the human factors surrounding the crew's response came into focus. Inside a private conference room, the cockpit voice recorder was played once again. Its harsh audio filled the space. The explosion, the roar of wind, the shouted commands, the fragments of communication between cockpit and cabin. Every syllable mattered. Human factors specialists paused the recording repeatedly, analyzing tone, phrasing, reaction times. Patterns emerged quickly. The captain's assertiveness, initially an asset, had sharpened into a kind of tunnel vision as he prioritized immediate descent. The first officer's structural concern, reasonable under the circumstances, had delayed full alignment with the captain's plan by mere seconds, but those seconds stood out in the analysis. The engineer's decision to isolate electrical systems, though technically justified, had consequences he could not have anticipated, affecting communication in the most fragile moment of passenger management. None of these were labeled as errors, but collectively, they formed a portrait of CRM stress fractures, cracks that did not break the operation but revealed vulnerabilities in cockpit coordination under extreme pressure. The bomb caused the crisis. Human factors shaped the response, and the response, though imperfect, saved the aircraft. During the formal debriefing, the captain spoke candidly. I felt decompression immediately. I needed altitude down. Fast. His words were steady, but investigators sensed the emotional weight beneath them. The first officer added, "The vibration worried me. I wasn't sure we still had full structural integrity." He explained his moment of hesitation, a pause driven by fear of causing the aircraft to shear apart during a high-speed descent. The engineer simply said, "I was trying to keep us from catching fire." His voice cracked slightly. I didn't know what the blast had done to the wiring. None of the three men intended to contradict one another. Each acted on incomplete information under impossible conditions. CRM, in its ideal form, demands shared situational awareness. But that depends on clarity, and clarity evaporates when a bomb tears open an aircraft at 37,000 feet. The NTSB made a critical distinction. The crew's momentary divergence in interpretation was not a failure of discipline, but a reflection of how drastically violent events distort human perception. But the report also emphasized how essential CRM is in modern aviation. The crew eventually realigned, restoring coordinated action in time to execute a safe landing. The investigators noted, had the crew not re-established cohesive resource management during the descent, the outcome could have been significantly worse. Meanwhile, across the tarmac, intelligence agencies pursued another question: who placed the bomb and when? Records showed that this same aircraft had once flown routes through Cairo, Beirut, and Athens during a time of heightened regional conflict. Intelligence services had long suspected that certain extremist groups placed delayed action devices on Western carriers. Many such devices failed or detonated prematurely. Others never triggered. This one had been carried by chance, by fate, until a flawed timing mechanism allowed it to live long enough to detonate on April 2nd, 1986. It had slept, unnoticed, through hundreds of flights, thousands of nautical miles, countless passengers entering and exiting the cabin, a silent passenger aboard every flight. Investigators traced blast residue to signatures associated with the Abu Nidal organization, a group known for aviation attacks during that era. Their devices often used barometric triggers or long-delay timers. Whether this particular device malfunctioned or executed its design intentionally remains debated, but the conclusion was unmistakable. The explosion on TWA Flight 840 was an act of terrorism. The investigation also highlighted the remarkable resilience of the Boeing 727 structure. Engineers noted that had the blast occurred closer to a structural frame, the aircraft might have broken apart. Had the decompression triggered at a different phase of flight, takeoff, initial climb, or approach, the crew would not have had the altitude necessary to recover. Had the crew delayed their descent by even 1 minute, more passengers might have succumbed to hypoxia or been injured by the sustained decompression. Every variable aligned just barely in favor of survival. In the final NTSB report, the human factors section took up more space than usual. It addressed distraction, divergence in interpretation, communication degradation, and CRM under explosive stress. The report emphasized how easily initial reactions, even among experienced professionals, can drift out of sync when dealing with incomplete data. But the report also acknowledged something else: resilience. The captain's decisive control inputs kept the aircraft stable. The first officer's caution prevented potential overstress of a compromised airframe. The engineer's systems isolation, though imperfect, minimized the risk of fire. And once the crew recognized the need for unified action, CRM reasserted itself, guiding them through the descent, approach, and landing. The aviation world learned a profound lesson from TWA Flight 840, not about mechanical systems or structural certification, but about the psychology of crisis. Explosions cannot be rehearsed in simulators. The violence, the shock, the sensory overload. It is not something training fully replicates. What training can address is how humans re-establish order in the wake of chaos, how crews recover their coordination, how they communicate with clarity when clarity is difficult to find. Airlines updated their CRM programs after the incident. Emphasis shifted toward rapid resynchronization under stress, techniques for combating perceptual tunneling, and protocols for confirming shared mental models even in fast-moving emergencies. Cabin crew coordination training also evolved, acknowledging the role of communication loss during decompression scenarios. Security procedures at international airports changed as well. Aircraft undergoing multi-leg international routing began receiving more robust inspections. Airports applied new screening protocols for checked baggage and cargo compartments. Political organizations responsible for aviation attacks were placed under greater surveillance by intelligence agencies worldwide. The incident reinforced a truth aviation already understood, yet never fully internalized: that safety is not a static achievement, but a process of perpetual vigilance. Days later, when the aircraft was finally cleared for transportation and forensic teams removed the last fragments of evidence, the captain returned to see it one final time. The 727 sat stripped of seats, interior panels, and carpeting. It looked skeletal, an exposed spine of aluminum and rivets. He approached the breach in the fuselage, touching the cold, twisted metal, not with reverence, but with respect for the brutal force that had acted upon it. He thought of the passenger who had been lost, of those injured, of the flight attendants who had fought through chaos, of the cockpit crew whose decisions had led them back to Earth. He thought, too, of how fragile the line is between order and disaster. Later, during his final interview for the investigation, he summarized the flight in a single sentence: "We survived because we didn't stop flying the airplane, even when we didn't fully understand what had happened to us." The phrase would become part of CRM training modules for years. The legacy of TWA Flight 840 lives not only in the forensic findings, but in the lessons etched into every checklist, every simulator session, every cockpit briefing conducted today. Its story reminds aviation that human error is not always a failure. Sometimes it is simply the beginning of a path back to coordination. And human resilience is not guaranteed. It must be trained, practiced, and strengthened. The sun set over Athens the evening the crew left the airport. The runway lights glowed softly, indifferent to the drama they had witnessed. The Mediterranean wind carried the faint smell of jet fuel and seawater, mixing with the weight of memory. And the story of Flight 840 was written into the sky, not as a tale of destruction, but as a testament to survival, vigilance, and the profound responsibility carried by every cockpit crew. Because every flight has a story, and this one left a lesson carved into the heavens.